In this lecture on Egyptian civilization, we are moving away from the political affairs that we considered previously to explore some of the fascinating social, economic, and cultural achievements of the Egyptians. In particular, I want to focus on the main cities of the Egyptians and on the social hierarchies and relationships that emerged in those cities. We also need to consider the flourishing trade that developed between Egypt and her many regional commercial partners as an early example of the exchange networks that were so important in ultimately tying agrarian civilizations to one another. And we will conclude by discussing two aspects of Egyptian civilization that remain enormously interesting to us today: its rich hieroglyphic writing system and its complex polytheistic religion. As we have discussed, one of the things that a big history comparison of ancient civilizations reveals is remarkable similarities in the way these complex societies organize their cities and their states, their people and their belief systems. These similarities are hardly surprising given that the evolution of most civilizations followed quite similar, often environmentally determined demographic and agricultural trajectories. Despite this, there are also many interesting differences between these civilizations, and part of our task as historians is to tease out and account for these. In several respects, urban life in ancient Egypt's agrarian society mirrors that of Mesopotamia. Just as in Mesopotamia, successful farming in Egypt led to the emergence of dense populations along the Nile Valley, and these populations evolved into a complex, interconnected society with a wide range of social roles, professional positions, and economic opportunities. Social hierarchies emerged in both civilizations, as they did in all ancient societies. Also, as in Mesopotamia, a river valley was an essential element in the development of cities in Egypt. Not only did the Nile River make agriculture possible, as did the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, but the Nile Valley also functioned as a natural highway that connected much of Eastern and Central Africa to the Mediterranean. And this in turn facilitated high levels of trade and cultural exchange throughout the region. Yet the nature of urban life in Egypt differed from that in Mesopotamia. As you may recall, successful farming and population and resource increases led to the appearance of enormous cities in Mesopotamia. The cities of Egypt were nowhere near as large nor as prominent as those in Mesopotamia, or for that matter, as those in the civilizations of the Indus Valley, of East Asia, or the ancient Americas. The reason is tied closely to the environment of the Nile Valley itself. Throughout the thousands of years that Egyptian civilization flourished, the great majority of Egyptians remained living in villages spread along the valley, villages that used the Nile River and simple irrigation systems to water their fields and also to trade surplus foods and goods up and down the valley. Egyptian farmers with ready access to rich alluvial soil and irrigation water did not need to cluster together in vast cities where powerful administrations took on the responsibility of constructing and managing huge state-run irrigation systems. In addition, because the Egyptians, with their divine pharaoh and centralized unified administration, along with their relative geographical isolation, were never as troubled by interstate warfare or regular invasion as were the Mesopotamians, so they did not need to build the walls and defensive structures that were a necessary feature of Sumerian cities. So while ancient Egyptian civilization did construct some impressive cities and decorate them with huge monuments of deep symbolic power, it was nevertheless much less urbanized than virtually all other ancient civilizations. The semi-legendary founder of the Egyptian state, Menes, sometimes also called Namur, created a unified Egypt by bringing together separate kingdoms around 3000 BCE. Menes is also recognized by historians as the probable founder of the first city in Egypt, Memphis, which he had constructed as a convenient and strategic site for his capital right at the midpoint between Upper and Lower Egypt, about 15 miles south of modern Cairo. The original name of the city was White Walls, a reference to the whitewashed brick of the king's palace. The modern name of Memphis is actually Greek and is based on the name of a nearby pyramid tomb called Men Nefer. Another Egyptian name for the city, Hutkar-Ptah, was later rendered into Greek as Aegyptos, and this became the name for the entire country of Egypt. Now, Memphis was an important city during the 500-year-long Old Kingdom period. We know this because of the extensive early dynastic royal cemeteries that have been found in the Red Desert Bluffs to the west of the city. Estimates of Memphis's population, even at its apogee, vary greatly, from as few as 6,000 to as many as 30,000. Not insignificant, but again, decidedly smaller than the great Mesopotamian cities. Although later dynasties moved their capitals and tombs to different centers, Memphis remained prominent through all the periods of Egyptian history. According to the 1st century CE Jewish historian Josephus, the king of the Hyksos, who invaded Egypt early in the 17th century BCE, also made his capital at Memphis. During the New Kingdom, Thebes became the most important Egyptian city, but even then, Memphis continued to function as a second capital of the state. Memphis was connected to the Nile by a canal, and during the New Kingdom, it was a bustling cosmopolitan trading city, complete with special areas for foreign traders, particularly the seafaring Phoenicians. Memphis remained important throughout the centuries of Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman control of Egypt, but thereafter the city was ransacked by Christian and Islamic rulers and was largely abandoned by the 7th century of the Common Era. Another Egyptian city of great symbolic power was Thebes, built on both banks of the Nile, about 420 miles south of Cairo. The city of Thebes contains some of the most iconic religious and burial sites in all of Egypt's long history, including Luxor and the Valley of the Kings. The town that evolved into the city of Thebes, known originally as Wassa, was an important Upper Egypt regional political center even before unification. And after unification, it served as the capital for several pharaohs. The Hyksos never were able to gain control over Thebes, and it was leaders of that city that eventually drove the invaders out of Egypt. The city then reached its peak of splendor and power. 18th dynasty pharaohs constructed great palaces, all brightly painted and surrounded by gardens, while the bustling city streets were full of foreign traders and citizens from all walks of life. During the religiously troubled reign of Akhenaten, the city fell on hard times and was abandoned by the court. But Akhenaten's son Tutankhamun restored the city and its centrality. Thebes declined again late in the 2nd millennium, but had revived sufficiently by the 7th century BCE for the Greek epic poet Homer to write of 100-gated Thebes. But after being sacked by the Assyrians around 663 BCE, the city dwindled and was a more or less abandoned tourist attraction for the Romans by the 1st century BCE. It's worth pausing just to reflect on just how ancient the ruins of Thebes are. For Romans living in the 1st century BCE, the abandoned and semi-ruined city of Thebes was already more than 2,000 years old, as long before the time of these Roman tourists as the Romans are before the modern tourists who flock to visit the ruins of ancient Rome today. One last fascinating Egyptian city is Heliopolis, the city of the sun, which was founded around 2900 BCE, but which now lies some 50 to 60 feet below a suburb of Cairo. Heliopolis became the headquarters for the worship of the sun god Re, and also a major cultural center that reached the height of its influence during the New Kingdom. Massive limestone blocks from the huge temple of Re that was constructed there during the New Kingdom were later purloined to build the medieval city walls of Cairo, where in some places they can still be seen today. Our focus here is the Egyptians, of course, but let's note that to the south of the Nile Valley, the Nubians constructed their own fascinating urban centers. One of these, Kerma, located just above the Third Cataract, was the capital of the earliest kingdom of Kush, which conquered Egypt in 760 BCE. Founded around 2500 BCE, Kerma grew wealthy because it dominated overland trade routes between Egypt and the Sudan for about 1,000 years. In the 10th century BCE, a new Nubian city, Napata, was built much further to the south and thus more distant from Egypt, so it was less threatened by the armies of the pharaohs. The capital of the later kingdom of Kush was Meroe, a wealthy trade city that thrived between 600 BCE and 100 CE, the site of some 200 extraordinary pyramid tombs and also of large-scale iron smelting. In fact, so much iron smelting took place in Meroe that it has been dubbed the Birmingham of Africa, a reference to the British industrial city that flourished 2,000 years later. Like the cities of Mesopotamia, all these Egyptian and Nubian cities were centers of considerable resource accumulation, and this led inevitably to the appearance within them of social hierarchies based on wealth. A series of well-defined classes emerged, with slaves and peasants on the bottom, religious and political elites on top, and an urban middle class of artisans and merchants in between. Within this middle class, pottery, textile weaving, woodworking, leatherworking, stone cutting, and masonry all became distinct trades. But here is another significant difference between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Although the city-states of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys were often ruled by individual kings and their elites, and sometimes by imperial conquerors like Sargon, in Egypt, the entire state was almost always under the control of a single or powerful centralized ruler. This meant that there was little room for a land-owning nobility with personal armies in Egypt, so it was the priesthoods and the scribal administrators that formed the upper social strata just below the pharaoh. And because many of these bureaucratic positions were open to different classes, it was theoretically possible for members of the middle class to work their way into positions of high social status through their administrative talents, something that was less common in Mesopotamian society. A clear similarity between Egyptian and Mesopotamian societies is that both built patriarchal societies that vested authority over public and private affairs in men. And yet, this also provides another important difference. Women in Egypt appear to have had more rights than women in Mesopotamia, and considerably more than Greek and Roman women would enjoy millennia later. Some Egyptian women became scribes, others worked as priestesses, musicians, as dancers, as artisans, and many royal wives had great influence. Egyptian women also enjoyed greater legal protections than in almost any other ancient society. They could manage, own, and sell private property. They could institute legal settlements before the court, free their slaves, and adopt children. Egyptian women could obtain their own private possessions by purchasing property with their own resources and even borrow money to do so, or receive property as a gift or by inheritance. If a woman brought private property into a marriage in the form of a dowry, this always remained her possession and would be returned to her as part of any divorce settlement. Egyptian girls married soon after menstruation commenced, so around the age of 18, and they acknowledged their new status by leaving their father's house and entering that of their husband. Divorce could be instituted by either party for a range of reasons, and most appear to have been resolved privately without need for government interference. Of course, I'm not suggesting that women in ancient Egypt enjoyed the same rights and freedoms as Western women in the 21st century. Egypt was always a patriarchal society in which men held public and private power. But, quite exceptionally in the era of ancient civilizations, not only did women enjoy unusual protection in law, they were also able at various times to rule the state as pharaohs in their own right. The best known female rulers are Hatshepsut, who reigned from 1473 to 1458 BCE, and Cleopatra, who ruled as queen from 69 to 30 BCE during the period of Roman control of Egypt. We're also aware of at least 3 other female rulers, one each in the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. A story demonstrates the stark difference between women's rights in Egypt and the situation in most ancient states. When Egypt came under Greco-Macedonian control in 323 BCE, following the death of Alexander, a 2-tiered social and legal system had to be instituted by the Ptolemies, who became the first ruling dynasty, the new ruling dynasty. Despite being wives and daughters of the conquerors, Greek women remained subject to the more restrictive laws and attitudes of Greek society, while the conquered Egyptian women were able to retain the legal status and far greater privileges they had long enjoyed under Egyptian law. The wealth that Egyptian society had available, thanks largely to its agricultural prowess, also enabled it to engage in trade, and not only in agricultural products. Artisans and craftsmen of the Nile Valley employed an ever-expanding range of technologies, many of them borrowed from Mesopotamia. Some of these technologies seem to have taken a surprisingly long time to diffuse from West Asia, a delay we can only attribute to the relative geographic isolation of Egypt. Bronze metallurgy, for example, did eventually make its way from Mesopotamia into Egypt and Nubia, allowing the Egyptians to also cross that important threshold of complexity by moving from stone to metal tools and weapons. But although bronze production was flourishing in Mesopotamia from as early as 3000 BCE, its use in Egypt only became widespread around 1700 after the Hyksos invaders used bronze weapons to take control of Lower Egypt. After the Hyksos were expelled, the armies of Thutmose and other pharaohs used up-to-date bronze weapons to conquer neighboring lands, but the metal was expensive to manufacture, and so its use was closely monitored by royal workshops. It wasn't until centuries later, sometime after 1000 BCE, that serious iron production began in the Nile Valley. The Hittites had developed smelting techniques in Anatolia around 1300 BCE, but it also appears to have emerged independently in some regions of Africa that had particularly plentiful supplies of iron ores. Some archaeologists believe that African smelters may have produced iron before the Hittites, who are generally credited for being the inventors of the metal. Along with these developments in metallurgy, Nile merchants and craftsmen also worked to continuously devise more efficient means of transportation, another development that had a significant impact on trade. We know that Egyptians were traveling up and down the Nile in boats well before 3500 BCE. The Nile flows south to north, which meant that these boats could easily ride the currents in that direction, except where the river's cataracts created an obstruction. And because the winds generally blow from the north, boats could almost as easily sail back upriver again. These developments in river transportation technologies led eventually to the establishment of long-distance trade networks that linked the Nile to the wider world. By 3000 BCE, Egyptians had sailed out of the Nile and into the Mediterranean. And by 2000 BCE, they'd explored the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Western Arabian Sea. By the New Kingdom period, much of Western Afro-Eurasia, including the Mediterranean basin, was functioning as a flourishing integrated trade network. Egyptians and a range of other peoples will meet in future lectures, including Phoenicians, Minoans, and Mycenaeans, exchanged an extraordinary array of commercial goods. One highly valued good in the Eastern Mediterranean was cedar, exported by the Phoenicians out of modern-day Lebanon to be sent to Egypt. One Egyptian record dated to 2600 BCE mentions a huge fleet of 40 Egyptian commercial ships hauling cedar logs from Lebanon to the mouth of the Nile. An even more detailed look into the Eastern Mediterranean trading network has come to us through the discovery of a sunken trading ship, the so-called Uli Boran shipwreck, which sank off the southwest coast of Turkey in the 14th century BCE. It appears to have been following a regular trading route, traveling counterclockwise from the Phoenician coast of modern Lebanon, past southern Turkey, into the Aegean Sea, then south to Egypt, and eventually back to Phoenicia. The ship was quite small, only 50 feet long, but she carried a valuable and eclectic cargo. In the hold were 350 ingots of copper from Cyprus and 1 ton of tin ingots. These are the ingredients of bronze, of course, so the copper and tin were on their way to a workshop somewhere to be alloyed together by metallurgists, probably for weapons manufacturing. Also discovered were 100 ingots of cobalt blue and turquoise glass, 1 ton of terebinthine resin, an ingredient of perfume that was stored in pottery amphorae, ebony logs from Egypt, elephant tusks, hippopotamus teeth, ostrich and tortoise shells from sub-Saharan Africa, and many regional fruits and spices. The wreck also contained a variety of valuable manufactured goods, superb pottery from Cyprus and Phoenicia, a gold scarab of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, Mycenaean and Levantine weapons, and Syrian cylinder seals. Another interesting item was a writing board on which notes could be made with a wax stylus, indicating that written records were a vital component of the trade. Trading north into the Mediterranean was not the only direction for Egyptian commerce. There was also a flourishing connection south into Nubia and even deeper into sub-Saharan Africa. Trade with Nubia was ongoing from at least 4000 BCE, well before Egyptian unification, and this intensified during the Old Kingdom period. To facilitate this, trade cities began to appear in Upper Egypt, cities whose very names were synonymous with commerce, like Aswan, a name that derives from the Egyptian word for trade, swin, and Elephantine, an obvious reference to ivory. There was a big demand for exotic African goods in Egypt, like ebony, ivory, leopard skins, ostrich feathers, gemstones, gold, and also large numbers of slaves who were brought down to the Nile Valley to work on a range of state and private projects. In return, it was high-value Egyptian finished goods, linen textiles woven from flax, plus pottery, wine, and honey that went back upriver and on deeper into the African continent. Although much of this trade with African states to the south took place up the Nile Valley and then overland to Nubia and beyond, during the New Kingdom, Egyptian mariners also traded extensively through the Red Sea with a mysterious East African land they called Punt. Located somewhere in modern Somalia or Ethiopia, Punt provided gold, ebony, ivory, cattle, and human slaves. We have an extraordinary visual source about trade with Punt, a painting depicting a trading expedition to Punt discovered in the tomb of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, dated to about 1450 before the Common Era. The painting shows large ships bearing jewelry, tools, and weapons, and also exotic southern export goods like monkeys and a panther. All this Egyptian trade with multiple commercial partners in the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa facilitated widespread cultural exchange and interaction throughout the region. Closely associated with trade and with keeping state and commercial records was the development of writing in Egypt, a common threshold invention of virtually every agrarian civilization. Writing first appeared in Egypt around 3200 BCE, possibly borrowed from Mesopotamia. The earliest script was pictographic, but the Egyptians soon began to add symbols representing sounds and ideas, facilitating more sophisticated written communication and collective learning. This writing system came to be known as hieroglyphic because it appeared especially prominently on temples. The name comes from two Greek words meaning holy inscriptions. Historians are fortunate that the hot, dry climate of Egypt also preserved for thousands of years many papyrus rolls, which contain written administrative and commercial records as well as literature. Although striking and dramatic, hieroglyphs were cumbersome to use, and over time they were employed only for very formal writing and for tomb and monumental inscriptions. For everyday records, a much simpler system known as hieratic or priestly script was devised by scribes, a simplified cursive form of hieroglyphs. Hieratic writing appeared in the early 3rd millennium BCE and was used extensively for the next 3,000 years through to roughly 600 CE. After that, hieratic writing fell into disuse when Egyptians adapted the Greek alphabet to record their own language, developing two new alphabetic scripts, Demotic, which means popular, and Coptic, which simply means Egyptian. The importance of writing and record keeping meant that formal education and literacy became well rewarded in Egyptian society. A wonderful Middle Kingdom document that we encountered previously, the Satire of the Trades, has survived the millennia to tell us something about the privileged life of an Egyptian scribe. It is an instructional manual written by a scribe named Duaketi for his son Pepi. After portraying many other professions in a negative and somewhat snobbish light, it extols the virtues of the noble profession of scribe. As with all ancient civilizations, religion was central to the lives of the Egyptian people, who believed that their gods played an active role in human affairs. Over time, the Egyptians came to worship hundreds of gods and goddesses, So on any given day, people would be sacrificing to their household gods for health and well-being, and also worshipping a range of local and regional gods. It was the early Old Kingdom pharaohs who elevated their own gods and religious centers to the level of state gods. All the most important gods had their own temples and priesthoods, and the temples owned vast properties that supported their often huge priesthoods. Two of the earliest and most important of the gods that were elevated from local to state significance were Ammon, originally a local Theban god associated with creation and fertility, and Re, a sun god originally worshipped at Heliopolis. By the Middle Kingdom, priests were increasingly associating the two gods with one another and honoring them in a combined cult of Amun-Re. When Egypt became an imperial power in the New Kingdom, some priests even suggested that Amun-Re might be a different name for the same universal God who presided not just over Egypt, but over all the earth. For a brief period during the Middle Kingdom, the cult of Amun-Re was challenged by Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who worshipped the sun god Aton and even changed his name to Akhenaton in Aton's honor. But under the reign of Akhenaton's son Tutankhamun, Amun-Re was restored to his privileged and universal status. Egypt's most popular cult was that of Osiris, the fertility god of the Nile, the father of the sky god Horus and the husband of the goddess Isis. Osiris was said to have been murdered by his evil brother Seth, who tore his body into 14 parts and scattered them all over the land. Isis retrieved the parts, bandaged Osiris back together, and gave her husband a proper burial. The gods were so impressed with Isis's devotion that Osiris was resurrected and became the ruler of the underworld. He was also responsible for the resurrection of bandaged, mummified kings and for the annual Nile floods as the symbol for the rebirth of the land. The Egyptian belief in the possibility of resurrection marks one final and particularly significant difference between the two first great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Mesopotamians believed, as epitomized by King Gilgamesh, that death brought an end to human existence. They appear to have had no concept of an afterlife. The Egyptians, in contrast, believed that death was a transition to a new existence, an idea clearly articulated in the funerary text called the Book of the Dead. It contains numerous spells that, if uttered correctly, were thought to help the deceased achieve immortality. It is this belief in, indeed this yearning for immortality, that underlies the practice of mummification, and it was an incredibly old belief dating from the very early stages of the Old Kingdom, when it was already believed that through mummification, ruling elites could be resurrected. The Egyptians believed that the souls of the dead left their bodies, but they had to be able to recognize those bodies after they were buried in order to reunite with them in the afterlife. As Egyptian culture evolved, eternal life was seen as something potentially attainable for all mortals, not just for rulers. And so many wealthy people also attempted to increase their dead relatives' chances of immortality by having their bodies mummified. So the bodies of deceased family members, friends, and even pets were wrapped in bandages soaked in natron in the hope that they would be protected from decay. Like the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, whose tomb caused such a sensation when it was discovered in the 1920s, the preserved body was adorned with jewelry, then placed in a coffin bearing a painted or sculpted likeness of the deceased to either pass into the afterlife or perhaps be discovered millennia later by British archaeologists. Can we say that because of these practices and its long history of relative peace and stability, Egypt was in some way a more optimistic civilization than that of Mesopotamia, a difference that is reflected in its religion and art? The incredibly long history of ancient Egyptian civilization was much less disrupted than that of Mesopotamia, and this must in part be attributed to its relative geographical isolation, which helped foster this sense of optimism. Safe under their semi-divine, all-powerful pharaoh, rather than a mere city or regional Lugal, millions of Egyptians went about their well-ordered, peaceful lives with barely a disruption for 2,500 years. Yet both Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations evolved complex hierarchical societies, a range of sophisticated technologies and writing systems, and worshipped powerful gods and goddesses. And they both left behind tremendously important heritages that, as we will see, profoundly influenced the subsequent evolution of civilizations in Afro-Eurasia. They remain just as astonishing and fascinating to humans in the 21st century as they were to those Roman tourists who wandered through the great abandoned cities of Egypt more than 2,000 years ago.